You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Tuesday evening. Welcome to my show. This is the Intrepid radio program, and I'm Scotty Roberts, your host, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can hear the audio that goes out to all the radio stations and all of our different outlets online, like iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and others, over at ODYSY1.com, Odyssey1.com. And you can join the live video stream over on my YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, Mr. all spelled out. And, of course, while there, you can join the live chat room, which has a lot of my regular friends, my regular listeners from when we were just a YouTube live stream, and join in the conversation about tonight's show. And you can also see, when you listen to any of the archives of these shows over on my YouTube channel, the live chat. You can no longer interact with it, but you can at least see what was going on in the chat as the show is broadcasting. And so I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I want to give a quick call out for, as you see, I've been wearing my new Penman hat the last few episodes. My friend John Penman of Penman Hats. And you can go over on the internet, go to penmanhats.com. And Penman is just like it sounds, Penman, penmanhats.com. And take a look at the amazing line of custom hats that he has. That's my alarm going off for something. Sorry about that, folks. And that's just sound effects, background sound. It's kind of like the Enterprise bridge. You know, I have all the little chatter and bleeps and blips going on, or an occasional dog barking or child whining in the background somewhere. So come on over to penmanhats.com, take a look at what he offers. Makes the finest in custom hats. He does all of his work is all hand stitched, all custom made. He also has a line of hats called the Everyman hat that is more, he has the pre-made blocks of the hats, and then he bashes them all individually for you, sizes them for you, and so on. So this particular hat I'm wearing is one that he had made for me, and it's I believe it's beaver pelt. And my dog, I had the hat sitting up last night on the tabletop in the bedroom. I had thrown it down on the nightstand. And the dog was very interested in that hat. I'm not sure why. I didn't know if she wanted to get a hold of it and chew it up because it was an animal pelt or if it was a hat. And it represented for her the dog's stigma of a uniform of some sort. So, but my dog was attracted to it. So keep your hats out of the reach of your puppies or your dogs. They might take a liking to them. And that could be disastrous. So go see Penman Hats, penmanhats.com. You can also find him on Facebook. We're going to have him, Rocky and I, on the Situation Room. We're going to have John on our show upcoming here pretty soon in the future. We're just trying to line up dates so they work for everybody. And John Penman Hats is headquartered out of Portland, Oregon, and he ships his hats worldwide. Go take a look. That's enough talk about that. I don't want to use the whole first hour just to talk about Penman Hats, although I could. So what else? There was something else going on that I wanted to make mention of here before we dove back into tonight's topic, which is, again, taking an examination of Gnosticism, of Christian mysticism, of Christian paganism, and how they all relate to the historical Jesus. And so we'll jump back into that in a few minutes. Maybe sooner than that if I don't think of what else it was I wanted to talk about. I had something go through my mind. You ever do that? And if I don't write it down, my mind is so cluttered and so busy with so many other things, I've got to carry around a little notepad. And you'd think by my age I'd have learned to do that a long time ago, and I haven't. So time to time I'll put a little notebook in my pocket. It's like journaling. Have you ever journaled? I've got my journal, and if you're watching online, you can see that. I've got this little journal here that has gone all around the world with me, and I write things down and I journal in this, but is it full to the brim? No. It's because I bring it along. It usually goes in my big cargo pocket, but I rarely remember to take it out. So there's only a few highly vaunted entries in there that are significant, a few plant and sprigs and things that I pick up along the way and that I tuck into the folds of that. So that's kind of what it's like. Taking notes on things that you want to do. It's like having that little notebook and pen in your pocket somewhere. But since we're a society of guys that no longer wears pocket protectors and tucks all our stuff down in there, I tend to forget to do that. I got to shove it in a back pocket or a cargo pocket or something, and then I forget. So all that to say, I can't remember the other thing I wanted to talk about. So I think we're just going to move right into tonight's topic without too much more fanfare or adieu, as they say. So we started talking the last couple of days about this topic of the historical Jesus. And just by way of quick recap, I grew up believing Western Christianity's version of who Jesus was. That's the cornerstone of that faith and that religion. And faith is the key word there. Faith is that thing that you use that doesn't need facts to back it up. You can overcome any obstacle that's thrown in your path for what you want to believe if you apply the faith story to it, the faith mode or method to it. People can say, well, look, there's no historical evidence that Jesus ever existed. And by faith, I can say, yeah, but I believe he was a real guy because the Bible says so, or because my religion taught me. It's a tradition that's been with us for 2,000 years. There must be something to it. As the book of Acts in the New Testament records, Gamaliel, who was a very well-known member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council in first century Judea, just after the time of Jesus, and probably during the time of Jesus, had said when there were protestations coming from the Sanhedrin saying we need to wipe this religion out, this what they considered to be blasphemy and heresy from within the Jewish faith, this new Christian thing, we got to wipe it out. And it was Gamaliel who said, no, just leave it alone. He said, if there's nothing to it, it will die. He said, if there's something to it, it will grow, and then who would we be to resist it? So that's what Gamaliel said. You can look that up and see some of the quotes of Gamaliel, some of his other work. He was a historical figure in the first century Judea. So all of this stuff that I'm talking about Jesus, about the possibility that he wasn't what we think he was, that historically he was different than we think he was, is going to fly in the face of what some people believe. But remember, belief is something that's based on faith. Knowing something, that gnosis or having knowledge, is saying that I have to base what I appropriate on what I know, as opposed to what I believe by faith. And there's a difference. And so to dare question a received history isn't very easy. It's not easy for me. It wasn't easy for me. Still isn't easy for me. I'll be very honest and say, while I have found that there are things intellectually that drive me away from Christianity, that there are heart things that were instilled a long, long time ago, programmed into me, indoctrinated into me, if you will, that still bring up those tendrils sometime to say, oh man, you're doing the wrong thing. You are really believing the wrong thing. You're either on the Hell Express or you're backsliding, or all of these different terms that came out of modern Christianity. And so it's difficult to believe that something which you have been told is true from childhood could actually be a product of falsification and fantasy. And sometimes that falsification comes because somebody comes along and isn't necessarily wanting to do something devious, but wants to put his apple on the cart, so to speak. And it changes things for us. And then we grow up, and then down through the ages, we have believed a certain tradition about something. It must have been really hard for the Russians who were brought up on the tales of kindly old Uncle Joe Stalin to accept that he was actually responsible for the deaths of millions. It must have strained credibility when those who opposed his regime claimed that he had in fact murdered many of the heroes of the Russian Revolution. And it must have seemed ridiculous when they asserted that he'd even had the images of his rivals removed from photographs and completely fabricated historical events. Yet all these things are true about Stalin. So it's easy to believe that something must be true because everyone else believes it. But the truth often only comes to light by daring to question the unquestionable. And that's really the category this falls into, with religious faith and with Jesus Christ especially. We're questioning you almost got to whisper it, questioning the unquestionable. Now, it's become very vogue and fashionable nowadays to say, I don't believe any of that. I believe that God is me and in me and all of that, and so on. I get that. I understand the philosophy behind that. But I also, it's like we used to say of Wiccans nowadays, that there are genuine articles, there are genuine pagans, but then there are what we call the acorn shakers of the week. Those that will go out and hug an oak tree and say, I'm pagan now, to fight against resist my parents' Methodism or Protestantism or Catholicism. I must resist. Fist in the air. Hashtag fist in the air. And yet, those are the people that I think aren't so genuine in their faith. They just want something different. And they'll take anything that comes along that makes the traditional look stupid to them, or be able to degrade what they believe is the traditional. And so by questioning the unquestionable, by doubting notions which are so commonly believed that they're taken for granted, that's where you step off the bus a little bit and you say, okay, I need to either unindoctrinate myself, as Jeff Dougherty says. I need to pull myself away from the programming. I need to step outside the box and look back in and see what's really going on. Is there something different than what I was taught? And the only way to get to good answers on this stuff is to do it with a genuine intellectual heart, if you will, combining those two things and saying, look, I can't be just driven by faith and by emotion. I have to be driven by what I can know. And this is the whole thing about the Gnostics. Gnosticism was gaining knowledge, having knowledge of something. And so, do you know what you believe? Or do you follow what you were taught you should believe? That's the big question. Now, you may come full circle and come right back to where you started and there's plenty of people out there who will take all this stuff of Gnosticism, of the mysteries of Jesus and so on. They'll take that stuff and they'll tear it apart bit by bit on an intellectual level and present a great argument for why what the Bible says is absolutely, positively true. The problem is we don't have a lot to back that up if you take it out of a faith context. And so it's a little up in the air. And I, for one, far be it from me to psychoanalyze God. It's not my job. But if God is who God says God is, at least in Scripture, Judeo-Christian scriptures, I would think that there would have been... See, I'm not God, obviously. God didn't ask me to take his place or to wear his sandals. But the big question has to come up. is that why did God do the things the way he did? It just seems to me, if you've got all these ancient messiahs that comprised all this wealth of information about people who lived before the time of Jesus that matches all the things that Jesus did, and then Jesus comes along, and so you can say, well, he's just another one of them. Why wouldn't God, as I said yesterday, reshuffle that deck a little bit and say, okay, humans, I see what you're doing. That's me. I'm coming down in human form. And so why didn't God take the power of himself to do something a little differently? So he stood out amongst what Christianity calls the phonies, or those that were set up by the devil as this diabolical mimicry of who Christ the Savior was supposed to be. Those are the questions I have, and that's what lends to it for me. If this is the God, the universe fell from his fingertips. He created everything from nothing. Yet he could not, in human history, make himself stand out as different from what the faith calls the fakes. That creates a problem for me as I look into this stuff from an intellectual level. So the whole idea of the Jesus mysteries is the product of having your mind opened up a little bit. Be open-minded and look back in. Don't be closed-minded and be just the literalist believer, but look in and say, is there something different here I need to consider? And so when it first occurred to me, it really seemed absurd and impossible to step outside that box and look back in. But now, it's really obvious, it's ordinary, it's commonplace to look back in and ask a question. So, as we've talked about before, the Vatican was constructed upon the site of an ancient pagan sanctuary. And because the new is always built upon the old, and in the same way Christianity itself, in its own foundations in Judaism, the pagan spirituality that preceded it with Gnosticism. All of these things are built upon something, and it's these building blocks. And what's more plausible than to posit the gradual evolution of spiritual ideas with Christianity emerging from the ancient pagan mysteries in a seamless historical continuum? It's only because the conventional history has been so widely believed for so long that this idea could be seen as heretical and shocking. And people just don't ask the questions anymore. I mentioned once before I was sitting in an adult Sunday school class in a big church in Detroit, visiting a friend of mine. And it was all these adults, and I knew a few of the people. It wasn't like I was just a visitor out of nowhere making trouble. I had lived there for a while and had attended that church, and I was familiar with some of the people. And the teacher was teaching something, and I had a question about what he was saying. And if I remember right, he was teaching about Genesis and creation. And I don't remember the exact question I had in my mind, but I rose my hand to ask a question, and my buddy sitting next to me pulled my arm down and said, "We don't ask questions in this class." Now, I, back home in Minneapolis, was attending a church at the time, we're talking, this is like 25 years ago, where our class was open discussion about things. And that's how I believe you learn things. You ask questions. Yeah, you can sometimes have occasions where you sit at the feet of the masters and hear them talk. When we did the Paradigm Symposiums, we had amazing people that were teaching up front. We didn't always have open question and answer time during their time on stage. But those people, I had asked everybody that was a speaker at the symposium, if we're going to pay you to be here, I need you to be available to the public. So not only do I want you to speak once or twice, whatever we contracted, but I need you in the public times, the off-stage times, to be available when people are just gathering in the lobby or sitting down in the bar or whatever they're doing. Come down and be available so people can talk to you and ask you questions. Asking questions is how we learn. Not asking questions, to me, there is a respect to a speaker at times, but that speaker should be open at some point to answer questions about what he's teaching you. So conventional history has been widely believed for a very long time about Jesus, about Christianity, without a lot of questions. And the questions that came along, they deal with them differently nowadays. You ask some questions 1,000 years ago, you could find yourself on a fiery pyre, being burned to death for being a heretic. Nowadays, you just get the church says, sorry you don't believe this, you're going to hell. And either way, fire was involved. So, how do you recover mystical Christianity? This stuff that existed at its very early stages before the foundation of the church. We've come across this small picture that's tucked away in the appendices of the old academic books. It was a drawing. There was a drawing of a 3rd century amulet. Now, I don't have a picture of it up in front of me here, but if you look at, yes, I do have a picture. For those of you viewing, sorry on the radio, you can't see it. On the cover of The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy was The Original Jesus, a Pagan God, is the subtitle. There's this amulet, and let me make sure you can see this. I'm just going to hold the book up. So you can see that amulet right there. And sorry on the radio, you can't see it. It looks like the figure of a crucified man on what looks a bit like an anchor because it's got this inverted V at the bottom of the feet. And there are some Greek characters on there and some little crosses and an arc across the top and what looks like a bit of a sideways sliver crescent moon above the cross. And this is all engraved on a little amulet. And so this is the picture, and I'm sorry you can't see it on the radio. You can see that if you come over to the chat room, or later take a look at the video. You'll be able to find this. It's this amulet, and it shows a crucified figure, which most people would immediately recognize as Jesus. Yet the Greek words name the figure Orpheus Bacchus. That's what's in the Greek here. If you take a little closer look here, folks, if you can see that, Orpheus Bacchus. You can almost make it out in the Koine Greek there. And it's one of the pseudonyms of the Osiris Dionysus amalgam of characters. And who would this image possibly have belonged to? Is it an anomaly of some kind in history? Is it a crucified pagan deity or some sort of Gnostic synthesis of paganism and Christianity? Either way, it's puzzling, but for looking into this amulet was perfectly understandable. It's an unexpected confirmation of the Jesus mystery thesis. The image could be that of Jesus or of Osiris Dionysus. To the initiated, these were both names for essentially the same figure. And the universe itself, by leaving these discoveries for us to find, is in a way telling us you're on the right track. And we're going to leave it there for a minute because we got to go out to break. Consider that and sit there for 2 minutes, mull it over. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks, from that break. I appreciate your sticking around and waiting on me to come back. We're talking tonight on the, by the way, the Intrepid radio program. If you weren't here for the first segment, this is Scotty Roberts right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go hear the audio version on the radio, or come on over to the simulcast video on my YouTube stream, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Let's jump right back into this. We were talking about this amulet, this amulet of Bacchus, Orpheus Bacchus, and we're looking at these things and saying sometimes these things pop out of history to reveal something to us. These things get here. I just want to make sure the Osiris Dionysus. I want to find. Sorry, I'm stumbling just a little bit because I'm looking for the exact Greek words that were on this amulet, and I may have just blurbed over my own notes here. Anyway, let's go back into it. So, this amulet that's here, who is that? Is that Jesus? No, it's Osiris Bacchus is the character that's on there, which is one of the prefigures of a messianic God-man type that bears some of the striking similarities to that of the Jesus story later. And so the universe encourages us along the way, if you will. It takes faith to believe that as well. Rocky and I spoke about that last night on his show. The universe leads us to believe certain things or to discover certain things, to add to our knowledge. And see, even the way we talk, I say believe. I said earlier in the program, in the first segment, belief is that thing that operates by faith, not necessarily always a head knowledge of having the information. Faith doesn't need information. Belief doesn't need that. Belief is something is the act of putting your faith in something. And we're so programmed to use certain words for things. Do you believe in ghosts? Well, yeah, I believe in ghosts. I've seen evidence of them. But do I believe in them by use of the word in its actual definition? No, not in that sense. So it's a way of speaking. But our beliefs are affected by things like this. Our operations are affected by these things. Our knowledge is affected by these things. Something like that amulet, I'm pointing over here, sorry, for those of you watching, just over to the book cover that shows the that amulet on it. These are the things that make us question things. This is an idea whose moment has really come to fruition in the last couple of decades. This whole Jesus mysteries thesis, if you will. We really have a good understanding that it upsets the apple carts. And there are some people in Christianity that are going to be deeply offended by this, or it will offend their sensibilities. Or sometimes I've found when it offends our sensibilities, it's because it reaches down deep and it hits that thing where we have our own doubts about what we believe, and we go, wait a minute, that's tapping and getting too close to the doubts I have that this is all real or not. And it makes us take a step back, or it makes us resist it. And we've seen a lot of resistance, I think, on that level. We've seen a lot of resistance from the church to these teachings. They first of all tried to wipe them out completely in the early centuries of after the time of Christ. But I think some of that is linked to the power and the control of the church as well. If you keep the people believing what you teach them, rather than there's something different, the church itself will not lose its power and its footing and its control over the common person and the common thinking person, unthinking person, the common mind, if you will. And so this is going to upset people. It's been hard to be constantly surrounded by lies and injustices down through the ages without experiencing this certain amount of outrage at the negative misrepresentation of the Gnostics. These people have been maligned down through the ages. And to have become aware of the great riches of pagan culture without feeling grief that they were so wantonly destroyed. Yet, we don't have some sort of anti-Christian agenda going on here. I don't have an anti-Christian agenda. My purpose in talking about Gnosticism and the Jesus mysteries and these alternate historical characters and questioning the firmly held beliefs of the church down through the ages is not for the purpose of just destroying it. I don't have an agenda that is anti-church and anti-God and anti-Christianity or whatever, however it may be plugged, and it's far from it. My interest isn't in division. It's in acknowledging the unity that lies at the heart of all spiritual traditions. And this is no exception, this stuff. The early literalist Christians mistakenly believed that the Jesus story was different from other stories of Osiris Dionysus, because Jesus alone had been an historical rather than a mythical figure. And this has left Christians feeling that their faith is in opposition to all others. It's like the old joke of the guy who dies and goes to heaven, and the angel is leading him down the golden streets, and he's seeing, oh, this group over there, oh, that's the Catholics, and this group over there, oh, that's the Presbyterians, that group, oh, that's the Buddhists over there. And then there's some group way over in this walled castle up on a hill. And he goes, who's that over there? And he goes, shh, that's the Baptists. They think they're the only ones here. The old joke, plug in whatever religion or name you want to put in there. But this is what we've been taught. And it flies in the face of that. But all spiritual traditions really represents that there's a unity at the core of things, that perhaps the teachings of Jesus aren't unique. Perhaps what was plugged in afterward was what made it unique, and it was within that religion. And Christians tend to feel that their faith is being persecuted all the time, and that it's in opposition to all other people. And it's really not. And if you understand your true origins in the ongoing evolution of this universal human spirituality, you're going to gain a little different insight. And you're going to see things in a different way. Christianity may be able to free itself from its own self-imposed isolation if it opened up and looked to these other things that were at its core. Gnostic Christianity was at the core. Gnosticism, the mysteries of Jesus, at the core, in opposition to what became the church in the 3rd century. And 4th century, I'm sorry, I get my 300s to 400s. It's in the 300s, so the 4th century. So while the Jesus mysteries, as we've called them, clearly rewrites history, it's not necessarily something that's there to undermine the Christian faith as it stands and as we understand it, but as suggesting that Christianity is in fact richer, deeper, with more meat on its bones down deep than we ever imagined. The Jesus story is a perennial myth, if you will, with the power to impart the saving gnosis, knowledge, which can transform each one of us into a Christ, being Christ-like, as that was interpreted in literal Christianity in the New Testament. Not merely a history of events that happened to someone else 2,000 years ago, but it's transforming us into something very active. And belief in the Jesus story was originally the first step in Christian experience, Christian spirituality, the outer mysteries, so to speak. Remember when we talked about the internal esoteric versus the exoteric mysteries? That's what this is all about. And so Christianity, the first step, was believing something exoterically. And its significance was to be explained by an enlightened teacher when the seeker was spiritually ripe. These inner mysteries imparted this mystical knowledge of God beyond more belief in dogmas. And although many inspired Christian mystics throughout history have intuitively seen through this deeper symbolic level of understanding, as a culture, we have inherited only the outer mysteries of Christianity, the exoteric things, the things that were meant to make you ask questions on a deeper level. It wasn't the esoteric that we inherited. And so let's dig into this a little more. I don't know how long we're going to go with this series, but I want to hit a couple of other things. And I'm drawing a lot of information from the Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, and a lot of other information that's out there. So stick with me here as we go on now, because we're going to dig into the pagan mysteries a little bit and see how this ties into what we think we know and understand about Jesus and about Christianity. And so Euripides said, "Blessed is the happy man who knows the mysteries the gods ordain, and sanctifies his life, joins soul with soul in mystic unity, and by due ritual made pure, enters the ecstasy of mountain solitudes, who observes the mystic rites, made lawful by the Great Mother, who crowns his head with ivy, and shakes his wand in worship of Dionysus." That was Euripides said that. And by the way, all this talk of the Great Mother, I want to get into this more, not immediately, but we're going to hit this. You think about the Virgin Mary and the status that she takes in the church. Does she not, when you think about it, become a modern Christian representation of the Great Mother in the pagan cultures, in the pagan mysteries? Does not she then take the position, and most of Christianity would bristle at this notion, does she not then become the divine feminine? She becomes a goddess. And of course, if you question this within the church, no. She's just a go-between. We pray to her, and they start explaining it away, and that all sounds like the very same thing as the goddess itself. Did you know that in the Old Testament, we talked about this when I was talking about the Exodus reality in my book on Moses and the Exodus, there is a scene after the Exodus where they've built the tabernacle, the big tent version of the temple that was their nomadic temple while they were out in the wilderness during the 40 years on the Exodus. And on the day it says that Moses dedicated this tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the Holy of Holies, that it said a great cloud, shining cloud, descended from heaven onto the tabernacle and into the Holy of Holies and settled on the ark, and that this was the presence of God dwelling on the Ark of the Covenant. And it was known as the Shekinah glory. And Shekinah is the word used in the text to describe the presence of God settling on the ark. But in the Hebrew, the word Shekinah is a strictly female-gendered term. So in a sense, it was talking about not just the gentler side of things and so on. It was talking about the female presence of God. You should have heard my seminary professors in Conservative Fundamental Baptist Theological Seminary trying to work their way around that intellectually. This was the female presence of God. A goddess, perhaps? Is this who the Virgin Mary was supposed to become in Christianity, the presence of the Gnostics or the pagan goddess? So, let's talk about paganism a little bit. It's a dead religion, right? It's more accurately this exterminated religion. It didn't simply fade away into oblivion. It was actively suppressed. It was annihilated. Its temples and its shrines were desecrated and demolished. Its great sacred books were thrown into bonfires. There was no living lineage has been left to explain its ancient beliefs to us. So the pagan worldview has to have been reconstructed from the archaeological evidence and texts that have survived, like some giant metaphysical jigsaw puzzle. And a pagan was originally a derogatory term that simply meant country dweller. It was used by Christians to imply that the spirituality of the ancients was some primitive ritual, rural superstition, a set of superstitious beliefs. But this isn't true. In reality, paganism was the spirituality which inspired the unequaled magnificence of the Giza pyramids. It inspired the architecture of the Parthenon, the legendary sculptures of Phidias, the powerful plays of Euripides and Sophocles, and the sublime philosophy of Socrates and Plato. This is what pagan spirituality did. Pagan civilization built these vast libraries to house hundreds of thousands of works of literacy, scientific genius. Its natural philosophers speculated that human beings had evolved from animals. Its astronomers knew the Earth was a sphere, which, along with the planets, revolves around the sun, not the sun around it. They've even estimated that its circumference to within a degree of accuracy. And the ancient pagan, the world of the ancient pagan, sustained a population not matched again in Europe until the 18th century. And in Greece, pagan culture gave birth to the concepts of democracy, rational philosophy, public libraries, theater, the Olympic Games, creating a blueprint for what we have now in our modern world. What was the spirituality that inspired these momentous cultural achievements? It was paganism, pagan spirituality. Most people associate paganism with either rustic witchcraft or the myths of the gods of Olympus as recorded by Hesiod and Homer. And pagan spirituality did indeed embrace both of those. The country people practiced their traditional shamanic nature worship to maintain the fertility of the land. And the city authorities propped up formal state religions, such as the worship of the Olympian gods, to maintain the power of the status quo. But it was, however, a third, more mystical expression of the pagan spirit which inspired the great minds of the ancient worlds. The thinkers, the artists, the innovators of antiquity were initiates of various religions known as the mysteries. And these remarkable men and women held the mysteries to be at the heart and the soul of their culture, of who they were as a people. The Greek historian Zosimus writes that without the mysteries, quote, life for the Greeks would be unlivable, for the sacred mysteries hold the whole human race together, end quote. And the eminent Roman statesman Cicero, he enthuses this. He said, these mysteries have brought us from the rustic savagery to a cultivated and refined civilization. The rites of the mysteries are called initiations, and in truth we have learned from them the first principles of life. We have gained the understanding not only to live happily, but also to die with better hope. That was what Cicero said. So unlike the tradition of the rituals of the official state religions, which were designed to aid social cohesion, the mysteries were this individualistic form of spirituality, which offered mystical visions and personal enlightenment. Initiates underwent a sacred process of initiation, which profoundly transformed their state of consciousness. The poet Pindar reveals that an initiate into the mysteries knows the end of life and its God-given beginnings. Lucius Apuleius, a poet-philosopher, writes of his experience of initiation as a spiritual rebirth, which he celebrated as his birthday. It was like the being born again experience in modern evangelicalism. It was an experience for which he felt a debt of gratitude that he could never hope to repay. Plato, the most influential philosopher of all time, relates. Now, by the way, Plato, there's not a lot left of his writings, but this is other people that wrote about him. He said that we beheld a beatific vision and were initiated into the mystery, which may be truly called blessed, celebrated by us in a state of innocence. We beheld calm, happy, simple, eternal visions, resplendent in pure light. The pagan philosophers were this enlightened group of masters of the mysteries. Although they're often portrayed today as dry academic intellectuals, they were actually enigmatic gurus. Empedocles, like his master Pythagoras, was a charismatic miracle worker. Socrates was an eccentric mystic prone to being suddenly overcome by states of rapture, during which his friends would discover him staring off into space for hours. Now, I'd love to know a little psychoanalysis of Socrates, what kind of guy he was. He committed suicide at one point, too. Was any of this state of mind of his, what brought that on? But he would be enraptured. He'd go into his own little world, his own little la-la land. We used to call it in college and Bible college, we'd say, hey, have you gone off to New Jerusalem or what? And so this is who some of these people were. Heraclitus was asked by the citizens of Ephesus to become a lawmaker, but he turned the office down so he could continue playing with the children in the temple. And Anaxagoras, shocked by ordinary citizens by completely abandoning his farm to fully devote his life to the higher philosophy. Diogenes owned nothing and lived in a jar at the entrance of a temple eating beans. You talk about the Stoic lifestyle. Could you imagine living in a jar? I'm claustrophobic enough as it is. I get wrapped up in my blankets in my bed at night sometimes, and I wake up in a cold sweat kicking, so I got to get free of it because I get claustrophobic. I couldn't imagine living in a jar. So some of these guys, these philosophers, were very colorful individuals. The inspired playwright Euripides wrote his greatest tragedies during solitary retreats in an isolated cave. He played the hermit. In the tarot, we have the hermit card. And when I see that pulled up for people, I say it's time to isolate yourself. Take yourself out of the things you're doing for a while. Find the time to isolate and go introspective. That's what Euripides did. All of these idiosyncratic sages were steeped in the mysticism of the mysteries, the pagan mysteries, which they expressed in their philosophies. Olympiodorus, a follower of Plato, tells us, not Play-Doh, like my kids are followers of Play-Doh, Plato, tells us that his master paraphrased the mysteries everywhere. The works of Heraclitus were renowned even in ancient times for being obscure and impenetrable, a little too cerebral for the public maybe. Yet Diogenes explains that they're crystal clear to an initiate of the mysteries. Of studying Heraclitus, he writes, It's a hard road to follow. This is what Diogenes said of Heraclitus. It's a hard road to follow. It's filled with darkness and gloom. But if the initiate leads you on the way, it becomes brighter than the radiance of the sun. At the heart of pagan philosophy is this understanding that all things are one. The mysteries aimed at awakening within the initiate a sublime experience of this oneness. Celestius declares, every initiation aims at uniting us with the world and with the deity. Plotinus describes the initiate transcending his limited sense of himself as a separate ego and experiencing mystical union with God. He said, as if borne away or possessed by a god, he attains to a solitude in untroubled stillness, nowhere deflected in his being, and unbusied with self, utterly at rest, and become very rest. He does not converse with a statue or an image, but with the Godhead itself. And this is no object of vision, but another mode of seeing, a detachment from self-simplification, or a self-simplification, a surrender of self, a yearning for contact, and a stillness and mediation directed toward transformation. Whoever sees himself in this way has attained likeness to God. Let him abandon himself and find the end of his journeying. So it's no wonder that the initiate Sopaterus poetically mused, I came out of the mystery hall feeling like a stranger to myself. This is the stuff, folks. It's at the root of Christianity, the Gnostic Pagan mystics. And we're going to dig into this more. We're out of time tonight, sad to say. We could really get into this and just keep rolling and rolling. But we're going to dig into this more a little bit. This whole thing of Gnosticism, this whole thing of the sacred spectacle, the inner mysteries, the esoteric mysteries, after the exoteric mysteries. So anyways, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you take your time to spend it with me. We'll see you tomorrow night. Sit tight.